Hey fearsome friends, from creepy ding-dong ditch, scary people in the woods, and a stranger that comes into your home and gets comfortable, here are 13 true Let's Not Meet stories. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. I've been in this subreddit for a while, and I only just remembered that this happened to me and is a relevant story, and it occurred about 10 years ago. I'm male and was 14 years old at the time when I was enrolled in high school, and my mum worked at a nearby apartment complex as a manager, so she'd pick me up from school at 2:40 p.m. and bring me home instead of riding the long bus ride. The day was completely normal so far, and she'd picked me up and brought me home from school, when not more than 10 minutes after I'd gotten home, a black car pulled up in the driveway, and I heard a hard knock on the door. I looked through the glass window on the front door, and I could clearly see a man wearing a hoodie. It was the middle of summer, and he was laying on the ground in front of the door. I guessed he'd assumed he was completely obscured, because my mum had a wreath on the door, and the space between the window and bottom of the door was wide enough that someone could probably assume I couldn't see them. Well, I saw him, and I ran and grabbed the house phone to call the police from the kitchen, where I could still see the car. I had a machete. I was a teenager that thought swords and stuff were cool, and waited around the corner of the door while still on the phone with the police. At this point, the man knocked again, so I took matters into my own hands and yelled as loud as I could, "Leave now or I'll kill you." I had a pretty deep voice for my age. Thank you, early puberty. So I guess he thought I was a full-grown man, because he got up and hauled ass like an Olympic sprinter. About 3 minutes or so passed and the police arrived at my house. We had no cameras or anything, so there was really nothing to go off of to pursue this person. The cops pretty much told me that I'd handle the situation well, and all about the laws about self-defense. The man never returned, thankfully. I've looked back on this a lot over the years, and this man almost certainly wanted to rob us. But what's creepy about this the most is that he had most likely scoped us out. Seeing there was just a teenage boy and a single mother, went through the trouble of learning our routines, and waited for what he thought was the ideal moment to rob us. We bought a handgun because of this, so I never really lost any sleep over it, because I knew if he ever came back, I had a surprise for him too. When I was about 9 years old, this would have been in the early 90s, my family and I lived in a house with a fairly big wooded area behind our backyard, and I say it was fairly big because it wasn't big enough that you could really get lost in it for very long, but it was big enough that you could walk into it for a good 20 minutes before making it to the centre. It got pretty thick in some areas, and you couldn't see any of the houses from the neighbourhoods once inside. To my friends and I, it was a magical world. We played in those woods all summer long, and my mum would let us go in there as long as we were back by sundown. As like I said, this was the early 90s, and times were a little different then. My best friend would come over, and we would run out there and play for hours. We played hide and seek, army, Star Wars, and anything we could think of. But our very favourite thing to do was climb trees. We had a favourite tree to climb. It was a huge pine out towards the middle of the woods, and the branches at the bottom were low enough that we could grab on and pull ourselves up. The branches leading up were all very strong, and we could climb really high and see a view from above most of the other trees. Sometimes when I got bored at home, I'd go out there by myself, and I'd climb really high in the tree and just think about stuff. I loved being way up there, as it was so peaceful and calm. One Sunday, I decided to go out on a solo mission in the evening. I knew I didn't have too long before dark, so I hurried into the woods to get a good climb in. I was up in my spot in no time, and I remember it was late summer. The weather was still warm late into the evening, and I wanted to be able to see a little bit of sunset, then climb down and hurry home. I just sat up there and daydreamed as I waited for the sun to begin to set. Then I heard a twig snap on the ground and looked straight down. I saw a man standing at the base of the tree, looking up at me. I remember he was wearing a filthy brown jacket, and he had a patchy beard. His hair was sticking up in random places, and looked like he had been relentlessly running his fingers through it. He was just staring at me with a bizarre expression that seemed to be one of wonder and delight. It was an extremely unnerving look, almost a look of someone that had just realized they'd stumbled across the gold at the end of the rainbow. That's the only way I can describe it. It made my blood run cold, and I went completely numb, like I'd been injected into my veins. I didn't know how long he had been watching me before I'd noticed him, and thinking about that still makes me shiver. We just stared at each other for a moment, but he didn't say anything, neither did I. It sounds strange, but I didn't want to scream or tell him to go away, because I had this feeling that told me not to provoke him in any way. After a few minutes, though, he finally spoke. "Are you coming down any time soon?" I shook my head back and forth, as I didn't know what to say to him. It was clear I was very uncomfortable at this point, and that should be enough to make a decent person go away. But he only grinned at me. Then he reached his hand up and grabbed the bottom branch of the tree, as if to test it to see if it could hold him. I do believe he may have been planning to climb up to me, but the lowest branch was flimsy, and it was not strong enough to hold a grown adult. I thank God for that. He soon realized this and gave up, but I had seen enough. I finally broke my silence and started to yell for someone to help me. I kept screaming and screaming. The man backed away a step or two from the tree and began to mumble and curse under his breath. Then he flailed his arms in the air in a rage and began making a motion like he was pushing an invisible person in front of him. Eventually he turned and walked away, sort of stumbling with each step. I don't think anybody heard my cries because nobody came to help me. I stayed up in that tree for what felt like hours, because I wasn't sure if he was really gone. Then I finally climbed down because the sun was beginning to set, and I couldn't bear to be out there at night. I hit the ground and bolted back to my house, positive that he would pop out from a shadow and grab me, but thankfully he never did. I made it home and told my parents, and my dad went out to look in the woods, but he never saw anybody. We stayed in that house for around another 2 years before we moved across town to a bigger house, and I never played in those woods again for the rest of our time there. I still think about that man sometimes. What would he have done if I'd have come down? I have no idea, but that question does keep me up some nights. Back in October 2020, I, an 18-year-old female, was visiting my boyfriend who was 17 in England for the first time. Since I'd never been to England before, we obviously went sightseeing in London, and before anyone thinks we're bad people, this was a few weeks before England had gone into lockdown again, and we made sure we wore our masks. So on one of the days out, my boyfriend's mum decided that I should see Camden Town Market, as it's a very popular area. When we got there, it was loaded with people, surprisingly, and many shops were open. My boyfriend and I split up from his parents and just walked around aimlessly, just seeing all the places and cool artwork on the buildings and such. Now at this time, alternative clothing and music was very trendy on social media, and there were a few old clothing shops on this strip of market. I saw a specific place that was crowded with merchandise, and even though I'd never really worn old clothing, I just wanted to see what the shop sold. Now I'm not going to actually give the name of the place for obvious reasons, but I just wanted it stated for the reason of this story, that this shop isn't even there anymore. I've researched it many times since this happened, and it's seemingly gone. So we decided to head inside, and it was packed tight with clothes everywhere. I genuinely couldn't believe how much there was, but it all seemed pretty much the same. It was all gothic alternative, and was just spilling everywhere. Seriously, the walkway was so small you couldn't even really see out the storefront window. There were 2 guys working in the store, dressed like normal guys, wearing black hoodies and just regular sweatpants. When my boyfriend and I walked to the end of the store, which wasn't that far back, as the store again was very small, we just stopped and looked at the clothes for a few minutes. Something to note here is that my boyfriend and I are both very awkward and shy people. So when we entered the shop, I personally was already anxious socially, as it was dead quiet. There was no noise. It was just us whispering, and even that felt too loud. I was trying to find a nice way to leave without seeming odd, since we'd only just arrived, and already I wasn't interested in the clothes. I pulled out my phone, and Guy 1 said to us something along the lines of, "No phones, please." And there was also a sign above us that stated no pictures. So I just thought they didn't like pictures being taken, which is fair enough. At this point, Guy 1 was standing a few feet behind us next to a side door along the wall of the shop, and Guy 2 was sitting in a chair across from this side door. I was getting bored and just wanted to leave, so I whispered to my boyfriend, "We can go now." And as we turned, Guy 1 opened up the side door and said, "We've got more downstairs. Come look." Now, a few things to note. 1. I'm slightly paranoid of being abducted, but then again, what girl isn't? And 2, yes, it's not bizarre for a shop in Camden town to have a lower underground floor level, as many of the shops we went into did. It was just slightly bizarre that this stairway resembled a basement, if you will, not an open and large stairway to the lower level like the other shops. It was just one door that opened up to a U-shaped stairway into the basement. After he said this, my boyfriend, the silly nut he is, just followed the man down the stairs. I stood in the doorway having this awful pit in my stomach and just watched them get halfway down, when all of a sudden Guy 2, who was behind me at this point, said, "Go on." And I felt so uncomfortable after hearing that. I just said, "No, I'm okay." Then called for my boyfriend and said, "We're leaving. Come on." And I just grabbed his hand and left very quickly. We walked down the road a bit, and I was very shaken up as it was just a very bizarre situation. If they'd had more clothes downstairs, why did they say it so creepily? Why not just say, "If you're interested, we have some more downstairs, just let me know." My boyfriend was not as spooked as me. He actually told me I was most likely overthinking it, and I understood why. But it wasn't until after I got home to the States and told my mum and co-workers about it that anyone raised any sort of concern. Everyone I've told this story to has agreed there was something off, and on top of the store not being there anymore, it just makes me feel more weirded out. I understand it could have been a genuine store, but the no phone thing, and the creepy basement gesture and the assertive way they spoke to us just made me not want to risk it. I, a 23-year-old female, took my 2 dogs, a cane corso and a labradoodle, on a walk on a nature trail near my home. My car was the only car parked in the parking lot when I arrived, so no one else was on the trail. The trailhead only has one entrance, and it has thick forest on either side of it. So my dogs and I started walking, and maybe 3/4 of a mile in, a man on a bike approached me from behind. I moved to the side with my dogs to let him pass me, and when he did, my cane corso lunged towards him. I held her back, but that was unusual behavior for her, and around 5 minutes after the biker had passed, he went by me again, going in the other direction and towards the exit. Again, my dog lunged at him. I thought it was extremely odd that he decided to turn around so quickly, since he couldn't have gone much more than a mile, which seems like an extremely short bike ride. He was dressed in biking gear and had a professional bike. It just seemed like he'd turned around very quickly after he'd seen me. I decided to stop and let my dogs rest, and I FaceTimed my boyfriend to tell him about the odd encounter. My boyfriend agreed to stay on the phone with me while I walked back because I felt unsafe. Then my dogs and I turned around and started heading back to my car. About half a mile into our trip back, both of my dogs lunged at something inside the tree line off to the side of the trail. They barked and growled and tugged on their leashes towards the area of the tree line, but I didn't see anything there. My dogs definitely sensed something though. We moved on then and made it to the parking lot, when I saw another car with the man's bike hanging on the rack of the trunk of it. Once I'd gotten closer to the car, I realized no one was inside. I have a bad feeling that man had very bad intentions, and I think that he'd biked back to his car after seeing me, walked to that spot on the trail, and hid in the woods to do who knows what. But then I had second thoughts, because I was on the phone with my boyfriend, and I had 2 big dogs with me. It makes me sick thinking about it now. I'm open to other explanations if anyone can think of one, as I want this just to be an innocent encounter, just a misunderstanding on my part. But it feels sinister, and I feel like my dog sensed his energy from the start. This situation made me realize that walking alone on a rural trail, even with 2 big dogs, is not safe for me. So back in 2013, I, a 20-year-old female, had recently moved to Australia with a friend. About a week after we'd moved over, we decided to go out in the city for some drinks. It got to around 1 or 2 a.m, and I had lost my friend, so I decided to leave, and I left the club and went outside to look for a taxi. Just then, a man approached me and told me his car was parked up the road, and that he could give me a lift home. He was around 30 years old with dark hair, which is literally all I can remember. So I can't really paint a picture, because I was young, dumb, and had been drinking. I said, "Sounds good, thanks." So we set off down the road to find his car. As we were walking, he was talking the whole time about his wife, work, and some other nonsense that I honestly can't really remember. And by that point, we had been walking for over 20 minutes, with him repeatedly saying he wasn't entirely sure where he'd parked his car, but he was sure it was just up the road. He then mentioned that his wife was at home waiting for him, but earlier on he had said that she'd gone away for work. I suddenly sobered up and became aware that I was with some strange man that had randomly been waiting outside a club by himself, and his stories weren't adding up. We had walked well away from the busy area, and now there was no one else in sight. I had no idea where I was, and was starting to freak out. He kept looking all around us, checking to see where he had parked his car, but I was starting to think he was making sure that we were alone. I was starting to really panic now, and my heart was racing as I was getting some mad, creepy vibes from this dude. What is about to happen, I thought, and I started to pump myself up to make a run for it, when lo and behold, a taxi turned down the street. I legit didn't even say goodbye, and just ran across the road. Thankfully it slowed down and let me inside. And as I was getting into the taxi, the man yelled out that he could see his car down the road. But I just slammed the door and waved goodbye, telling the taxi driver to boost. Thankfully I got home in one piece, but was still unsure if this man was a nice guy or not. What normal married man hangs out around clubs and offers intoxicated girls a ride home? It's a bit suspicious, to say the least, and I'm honestly so grateful for that taxi arriving when it did, as who knows what could have happened if it hadn't. I was a 17-year-old college student in France when this happened. I was living in an apartment next to my college campus with 2 roommates. Let's call them Alex and Polly. And one day I was coming back from class around 5:30 p.m. when I saw a guy waiting in front of our building. It was the kind of old building where you can enter without ringing a doorbell. It was a big residence, so I just passed by him without really caring about why he was there. When 15 minutes later, the same guy came up to my apartment. He pretended that he was one of Alex's friends and that he was waiting for him, but Alex wasn't back until late. He also told me the exact place where Alex was doing an internship at the time, and even told me about his schedule. With all the information he gave, I was confident that they knew each other, so I just let him in. Now for the record, Alex's father used to work for a big company at the time, so even by looking up on the internet, it was impossible to find anything about him. Being a good host, I offered him something to drink and started talking with him whilst we waited for Alex. The conversation quickly turned dark when he began to tell me about his suicidal past and about the amount of guns he was keeping at his home. In France, it's really unusual to have a gun at home, except if you're a hunter or in a profession that requires one. It was getting late now, and as the conversation got darker, I started to feel uncomfortable with him. So I decided to send a text to Alex, just to let him know that his friend was here and that I wasn't feeling very comfortable. Alex answered me a few minutes later, asking me to send him a picture of this friend so he could see who it was. I took my phone and discreetly took a picture of the person in front of me, and after receiving it, Alex told me he was on his way home immediately. When Alex arrived then, I was relieved. He came in the living room and said hello to his friend, but then he just sat down and an awkward silence ensued. After about a minute, I received a text from Alex telling me, "I don't know this guy." At that moment, I thought he was joking around, but after seeing his face, I knew he was serious. So there we were, two young college students stuck with a stranger that apparently knew a lot about Alex without having even met him. We were both really young at the time and didn't really react in a good way. Every human being in this kind of situation would have called the police or asked him to leave, but we were really lost and didn't know what to do. We were scared of his reaction if we'd have asked him to leave. So we thought, hey, let's eat early so he will feel uncomfortable not being invited for dinner and leave. But as we were dining in the kitchen, he just stayed in the living room and started to watch TV without even asking us first. At the same time, our third roommate, Polly, had just come home from work. She entered the apartment and said hi to the guy in the living room before joining us in the kitchen. She asked us who he was and was not really happy when we told her we didn't have any idea of who he was or how to make him leave. We explained to her our dumb strategy of just living our life until he felt uncomfortable and left, so she started to act with us and told us about her day. At that time, Polly was going through a rough period and was telling us about it, which wasn't really a fun story to tell or listen to. But while she was telling us about her misery, the guy in the living room joined us in the kitchen and started laughing about Polly's story before going back to watch TV. It was really creepy. Just then, Alex had had enough and asked us to leave the apartment while he was going to deal with the guy. This is what happened once we'd left. Alex went back to the living room and started to act like he was going to go to bed. Another dumb plan, I know. Alex opened the door to his bedroom, which was next to the living room, and he told the guy he was about to go to bed, leaving the door half open while starting to remove his jewelry. He noticed that the guy on the couch wasn't moving or reacting to the fact that there was no one left in the apartment except Alex, who was now going to bed. Alex then went up to him and told him that maybe it was time for him to leave, as he was his friend and that he was going to sleep. But the guy replied to him, "I'm waiting for the girls." Alex got mad now and finally chucked him out of the apartment. At the same time, Polly and I were on our way back into the building and met the guy on the stairs. He wished us a good night with a creepy smile and left. Going back into the apartment, Alex told us what had happened, and we started to ask ourselves, who was that guy? How did he know Alex's name and surname? How did he know where he was working and his schedule? How did he find our address? We spent most of the night trying to find an answer to these questions without any success, but we learned from our mistakes and decided to never open the door again to anyone we didn't know. 2 weeks later, Polly was chilling in her room, and she was home alone. Her room had a view of the parking lot, and as she was looking through it, she saw a red car pulling up. The guy was back. Polly luckily then had the good idea to note his license plate and to check the door was locked. The guy came up to the apartment and told Polly the exact same thing that he'd told me the first time he came. Polly got mad then and told him that if he was still there in 5 minutes, she was going to call the police, and that was the last time he came. A few weeks later, Alex came back from home after working, telling us he'd finally remembered where he'd met the guy. Alex used to go into a bar where you're able to play video games whilst drinking, and apparently the guy was in the same bar at the machine next to him and had tried to talk to Alex, but he was too focused on his game and only took the time to say a quick hello. We think that the guy had probably followed Alex around for a week or two after that day, and we moved out of the apartment a few months later. I've known about this subreddit for a while now, but I've never gotten around to telling my own story, which of course I never thought I'd have. It happened in my senior year of college, and I lived off campus. I had 2 roommates in my apartment, which was a townhouse, and they were named Natalie and Katie. Katie was out that night doing homework in one of the school buildings, and I was awoken at 3 a.m. when I heard some knocking at the door downstairs. I thought it was weird considering the hour, but I figured somebody had the wrong place and would realize and just leave. But the knocking didn't stop. I lay in bed for a good several minutes thinking, yeah, they'll go away now. They'll go away, they'll get bored. And as one might expect, I started to grow confused, and then kind of freaked out by this person's persistence. The knocking then turned into banging, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Honestly, I probably should have called the police right away, but it was the middle of the night, and I was just confused. So I headed to the top of the stairs to see Natalie standing near the door, staring at it. Her room was on the bottom floor, so she had just walked up to it, and we exchanged a baffled look, because what the heck? It's 3 a.m. and this is weird. Natalie called out and asked them who they were and what they wanted. "We're friends of Katie's," said the voice on the other end, who sounded male and about our age. "We know her boyfriend, and we heard she was feeling down, so we came to surprise her." That was already a weird story, because again, 3 a.m. But thankfully Katie wasn't even home, so we both informed them of this. "Katie's not here, she's off doing something else." Good. They're gonna leave, right? They came here to see Katie. She's not there. They'll leave us alone and we can go back to sleep. "Just open the door," they then said. I know. If I hadn't called the police before, I definitely should have done it now. It was weird though. That night I realized why people do stupid stuff in horror films. Not only had I been woken up out of the blue, but it felt surreal to be in a situation like that. Like there's no way you could actually be in danger. It only happens in horror movies and true crime documentaries, and in questionable creepy stories online. It would never happen to me. I'm just a random, ordinary, boring person going about my business. I don't need to call the police. I'm sure this will get cleared up and everything will be fine. So yeah, Natalie and I did the stupid thing and tried to argue with them. We told them that again Katie wasn't there, and there was no need for them to stay. Eventually Natalie asked what their names were. Throughout the encounter we made out 2 distinct voices, but only one gave us a name. So I texted Katie without telling him, asking if she was friends with someone with that name. After a couple of minutes during which we were still arguing with the stranger, Katie replied with, "I am, but I don't think she knows where I live." That wasn't good. But even worse, did she say she? The person on the other side of the door had a male voice, so this was a real name, but not the real person. Whoever this was knew stuff about Katie and who she hung out with. I told Katie to stay where she was and not to come back until we told her everything was okay. Then finally we told the guys that if they didn't leave, we were going to call the police. No, don't call the police. Don't call the police, okay? If we wanted to do something bad, we already would have done it, right? Yeah, that last bit wasn't helping their case. Just open the door, okay? The attempts at reasoning with them basically devolved into them telling us to just open the door over and over again, until we finally actually did call the police. We hid in Natalie's room and dialed 911, explained what was going on, and thankfully there was a police station close by, so it didn't take long for them to arrive. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of heading back into the living room and yelling through the door that we'd called the cops. But contrary to what you might think, that actually didn't seem to scare them at all. They seemed only mildly upset, and kept arguing. To this day I can only assume they just didn't believe us. Then we heard a neighbouring home's door swing open, and a very pissed off man's voice say, "If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police." And for whatever reason, that was what caused them to freak out, and they drove off. The police arrived and we told them the whole story. Natalie revealed that a couple of times she had just barely peeked through the blinds of a window close to the front door, and she noted that there were 2 guys, but only one of them was ever at the door at any given time. They would switch, with one at the door and the other sitting in the driver's seat of a car parked out front, presumably for getaway purposes. So yeah, that's reassuring. They also hadn't looked drunk, according to Natalie, and they definitely hadn't sounded drunk. There wasn't much the police could do though besides sweep the area a bit, but they told us that if the strangers showed up again, to immediately call instead of engaging with them. One of the officers gave us some self-defense tactics and told us what kind of household items, chemicals would work best for self-defense. Then after making sure everything was okay and reassuring us, they left, and we eventually called Katie and told her the weirdos were gone. She arrived and was understandably a bit shaken herself, and we sat down and asked her who might have known where she lived. She did know people who had come to the apartment, so some people, certainly, but Natalie hadn't recognized the guys outside as any previous visitors. What was worse though was it turned out that not only did they know Katie's friend's name, but they claimed to know her boyfriend, even though he didn't live in the state we were going to school in. She swore up and down she didn't know anyone who would want to hurt her, but by this point it was around 5 a.m, so I didn't even bother going to sleep, as I was going to a workshop that morning. I told a lot of my classmates the story of what happened, and it freaked them out too. The entire day Natalie and I jumped at every unexpected noise, every shadow, every random movement, and that night it was hard to sleep. I just expected to hear knocking at the door at any second. Thankfully they never came back, but that almost makes things more unsettling in a way. I'll never ever know what they wanted that night. Did they think we were hiding Katie? Was she seeing less than savory people in secret? Did they want to hurt her? If they did, why did they never give up and go looking for her elsewhere? Was all of that just an excuse to get into an apartment of young women? Did they want to kidnap us, hurt us, rob us? Who knows? I try not to let it bother me, but I wish I knew if my life was in danger that night. I have the feeling it might have been. After all, they weren't wearing face coverings, so if they wanted to commit a violent crime, they might want to get rid of the witnesses. It was around 2 a.m. and my girlfriend and I were woken up by an extremely loud banging on the door to the building. We live on the 3rd floor, as well as our doorbell being rung continuously. Obviously the banging scared the living hell out of us, and after a few breaths, I opened the window and popped my head out to see a woman and a man, who was now on the phone, and they were both by the front door. I yelled out, "Hello?" And the girl said she lived there. The week before this, we'd just seen a new girl leaving our apartment building as we were entering. And as it was night, therefore dark, I'm on the 3rd floor, and I had just woken up. I thought it was her. We figured I should go down and open up for her and her boyfriend, since my girlfriend was scared as hell, and it's better to be a man in those situations. Well, perhaps. But anyway, my girlfriend was standing at our door listening in case something happened. I opened the door and let them into the tiny hallway that leads straight to the tiny spiral staircase, and as I moved to let them pass me to make sure they actually lived there, they didn't budge. They stank of alcohol, and the guy looked almost homeless based on his shabbiness, as well as a big plastic bag hanging from his shoulder. He said he had just moved into the 1st floor, and that for some reason couldn't open the front door. Also, he asked if I was Alex, which I wasn't. The girl, who looked pretty normal, asked me what floor I was staying on. He was now fumbling with his keys, trying them from the inside of the door. I asked him if they were able to get into their apartment, but they didn't answer. Suddenly the guy realized that he was at the wrong address, and asked if he was at X address. The girl said she was just with him and didn't know the area, almost laughing about it. Then the guy became very apologetic and kind, and off they went. Now the first thing I thought was that they were just drunk and the guy was bringing the girl home and had just messed up the address since he'd only just moved into a new place. Even more so because the address he gave me had a similar door to ours, thanks Google Maps, and was right down the road across the street. But the building was not the same at all, far from it, and they didn't seem that drunk. What questions that theory is that the girl said she lived there, and then later on she said she was just with him. The extremely loud banging, I'm still surprised none of my neighbours came out to see what was going on, and them not wanting to go in front of me, then not answering me when I asked if they could get into their apartment, and realising it was the wrong building. Plus the second I questioned them, and it became obvious I wasn't leaving them alone, with him looking like he did with his big bag too. In hindsight, I should have just talked to them from the window or called the police, but it was pretty far down, and I'm not fluent in the language here, so maybe they wouldn't have understood me when it was unclear due to the height difference, and my girlfriend was too scared to talk anyhow. We were pretty sure it was our new girl neighbour, which was why I went down to open up in the first place, as I would have never done it otherwise. So this happened when I was probably 13 or 14, so sometime around 2013. I live in a very small town in New England. So small it had no stores, not even a gas station, and the population is less than 1,000. My friend and I, after a day of school, decided to take a walk on an old rail trail behind my house. This rail trail goes on for miles and crosses several states, almost in a perfect line. These days it's not in use, and there aren't even train tracks anymore, just a long path. So that being said, many people in town used it for walks, biking and horse riding, etc. So on this day we decided to take a walk, which we rarely did. So we walked up behind my house and started down the trail. We probably made it a mile, then turned around to head back. Whilst heading home, one of our topics of discussion was horror movies, and we both got a little spooked thinking about all the scary stuff. But it wasn't like we felt truly unsafe and scared in that moment. It was just the thoughts. Because of this, I felt a need to turn and look behind us. And on doing so, about 100 feet away, I saw a man walking, wearing a long black trench-like coat, and he was holding something in his hand. The second he saw me turn my head and look at him, he began sprinting towards us. I told my friend, "Run," so she turned to look. And well, we ran like our lives depended on it. We ran all the way home and went to my barn, which is at the top of the hill on my property, so it was the closest safe place in relation to the trail. Still to this day, no one has believed us, but there was just something off about this guy. Could he have just been a jogger resuming his run after a break? I guess so. But why the long coat? And what was he holding? Like I said, my town is extremely small, and there is absolutely no crime here. So it may have been hard for others to believe there were any malicious intentions. But like I said, it felt wrong. And the way he just began sprinting towards us when I saw him still haunts me to this day. He just looked menacing. So this happened in 2016, when I was a 17-year-old female first college student in film school, and I'm now 22. My name is Julia, and I lived alone in my first ever apartment. It was really small, but I was really proud of my independence. I'd never felt unsafe in this apartment for several reasons. There were multiple gates in the residence that needed to be opened through a code, and only the people who lived there knew it. My door had 3 different locks, and it was right next to the university, so people who lived in the neighborhood were college students, and nothing bad had ever happened in the neighborhood before. I've always been very careful with locking the door when I leave my home, and I always check twice, which is slight OCD, so this one time I left to go to class and locked my door as usual, but for some reason I couldn't get the key out of the lock. It was completely stuck, so I went to the caretaker of the building to help me, but he wasn't there and I was getting more and more late for class. So I went to class with the key still in the lock after taking it off the keychain first, so it wasn't too noticeable. And when I got home, the caretaker was back, so he came to help me, and we couldn't get it out for 15 minutes, until somehow he did. He told me that the lock was damaged, but that I didn't necessarily need to change it if I only locked it once instead of twice. I just said okay, and that was the end of it. I really wasn't worried because of how safe I felt in the building anyway. Fast forward to 2 months later, when I was taking out the trash one night around 11 p.m. I was on the phone with my sister at the time, and I remember telling her that I was taking out the trash, then that I would take a shower afterwards before heading to a party. Now, as I'd previously said, I always locked the door, even just to take out the trash, but because of my lock being damaged, I only locked it once. When I got back to my apartment though, I found it was unlocked, which immediately alarmed me. So I went into my apartment and locked the door immediately, with 3 different types of locks. You see, when you walk into my apartment, which is just 215 square feet, you have the main room in front of you and the bathroom door immediately to your left. I had the bathroom door slightly open, enough so I could see a man in my shower turning his back to me. Naturally, when I saw this, I tried to open the door and leave as fast as possible, except my main lock was damaged from 2 months earlier, and I couldn't open it no matter how hard I tried. At the moment, all I could think of was the fact that I had to leave as fast as possible, and I jumped out the window without really thinking, figuring it was the only solution. Except I lived on the 2nd floor, so I completely smashed my ankles in the landing. I started running in whichever way I could, and when I got a little bit further from the building, I looked back and a man was there at my window, watching me run away. I thought of 2 possible outcomes. Either the man was going to jump and chase me, except I wouldn't get far with my twisted ankles, or he would get scared of the height and be locked in my apartment. Thankfully, he picked option 2. I went to hide in a bush a little further and called the police, who arrived in just 10 minutes because I lived so close to the station. They pushed my door open, and the man was there just sitting on my couch, holding a kitchen knife, waiting for me to come back. Like he didn't think I would call the police. They arrested the guy and later told me he had already been arrested for sexual assault, rape, attempted kidnapping and attempted murder. They also told me how everything had happened. Like I said, it was a very friendly neighborhood with mostly college students, so he'd gotten inside the building by other people holding the door for him. Then he heard me telling my sister I was going to take a shower, which was why he was waiting in the bathroom for me. He messed up my lock while I was taking out the trash, and he'd apparently noticed me on school campus and followed me to my home several times before succeeding in actually getting in. He stayed inside waiting for me because I had recently changed my phone, and the previous one was still on the table, so he thought I didn't have a phone with me to call the police. I don't live there anymore, but after that, to get into the building, we all needed identification proving we lived there. Building IDs were created, and we had to scan them every time, and it was the only way to go inside the building. Nothing bad happened in the neighborhood after that, and it's back to being very peaceful and friendly. First of all, I'm biologically a female, 5 foot tall, 24 years of age at the time, but getting mistaken for a teenager all the time, as I had a baby face and tiny frame. And second of all, I live in Europe, so I never owned a gun. The encounter took place a few years ago when I was living in a super huge apartment block, which was really quite shitty. One late afternoon, I was just chilling with my then girlfriend, when I suddenly heard faint scratching noises outside of the door. It was definitely weird, but I dismissed it, thinking it was probably some neighbor kid scratching walls with a key or some other stupid stuff that kids sometimes do. But a moment passed, and the noise didn't stop. Quite the opposite, actually. It got louder. At this point I started realizing what the sound was, and it was the sound of a metal object scratching on my door's lock. I immediately became alert and startled, and went to look via the peephole. The long corridor was half dark, and right there in front of my door there was a man. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I was 100% sure I didn't know him. He was tinkering with the lock in some way, but with the peephole's limited field of view, I couldn't see what he was doing exactly. I made sure all my locks were, well, locked, and I backed off as it fell silent. Just as I was about to return to the living room, the door handle slowly moved down, pressed from the other side, and just as slowly returned to its initial position. I freaked out and hurried to the kitchen, grabbing the biggest knife I had, and squatted next to the door. It was locked, but if he'd managed to pick it, well, there I was, frightened and armed. For a moment it fell silent again, and then the lever slowly went down and up again. There was more scratching, and the lever moved, then silence again, when suddenly I heard a whisper, "Let me in," and my heart skipped a beat, or a dozen of them probably. "Let me in, let me in." If he'd have been screaming, it would be as frightening, but he wasn't. He was just whispering at my door repeatedly, "Let me in." I think I unfroze for a second because I grabbed my phone and called security. The apartment block had security, but they were stationed in a small booth outside of the block itself, which was huge, and I lived on the 8th floor, so it was a really long way to get there from their place. Especially given that they were lazy and usually just watched TV and smoked so much there was a heavy fog inside of the booth. Still, I gave them a panicked call, quickly explaining the situation, and sure enough the guard laughed it off, saying the stranger was probably just some drunk neighbor. He told me that the other guard was on patrol and that he'd call him and tell him to come by. I have no idea why I didn't call the police, but I was just probably too frightened to think straight. The block was in the middle of nowhere, so the nearest police station was quite far away anyway. My girlfriend just kept observing, probably some kind of a stress reaction too, and seconds felt like hours. After some time it fell silent, and this time for good. 15 minutes later or so, the freaking security guy finally knocked on my door, long after the guy had gone. "Good job, man, seriously. Took your sweet time, thank you very much." He said they'd closed the gate and checked the camera footage, but he didn't look too concerned, so I don't know if they actually did do that. To this day, I have no idea what had happened. Maybe it was some drunk neighbour who left the elevator one floor too early or too late and thought his wife had locked him out. Maybe it was just some psycho or a junkie trying to purposefully access my door. I will never know. I guess I prefer it this way. I didn't see him ever again. The block itself was so big that it was actually a neighbourhood on its own. But the area started getting worse and worse, and we finally moved out. But not before having a few more experiences like that. When I was 13 years old, my father and I would take daily trips to our local laundromat to do our drying because while we had a washing machine at home, our dryer had died and we couldn't afford to get a new one. Usually we'd just sit in the car in the parking lot and listen to the radio, or go for a drive along the river. However, with the winter weather quickly approaching, my father needed to get some new wiper blades for his windshield wipers and decided to drive up the road to Walmart. While he went to the automotive section, I decided to go over to the books and magazines to see if they had anything that interested me. As I perused the shelves, looking at the graphic novels and paperback books, I heard a kind of soft sobbing coming from behind me. I walked to the end of the aisle and saw the source was a guy a few aisles over, sitting on the bench near the pharmacy section. He saw me looking at him and stood up and moved down an adjacent aisle. Returning to what I was doing, I decided on getting Ultimate Spider-Man Volume 3, titled Double Trouble, and I was about to join my father in the automotive section when he texted me and asked me to grab him some deodorant from Health and Beauty. I walked down the few aisles to the Health and Beauty section, and that's when I saw the guy again. He was just standing staring at the shaving cream, still sobbing, and I just shook my head and grabbed a thing of Old Spice deodorant, my father's brand, and was about to leave when I heard a loud huffing noise followed by a loud grunting. I turned to see the sad guy standing there, holding a razor blade in his left fingers, stained with blood, and blood pouring from his wrist of his right arm. I immediately ran from the aisle looking for someone and found an employee nearby stocking shelves. "Help!" I shouted, pointing to the Health and Beauty section. "A guy just slit his wrist over there." The next several minutes were a blur of employees and paramedics who rushed over to help the guy, and my father and I watched as he was wheeled out on a stretcher and loaded into the ambulance. According to the newspaper a few days later, the guy survived his suicide attempt, having sliced horizontally instead of vertically. It turned out he had been newly divorced from his wife of 10 years and didn't want to be alone. I hope that he got the help he needed and didn't try to kill himself again. As I'm writing this, it's been a few hours since this happened to me and my friends, and I'm still a bit shaken, but hopefully writing this helps me calm down a bit. For a bit of background, I'm currently 19 years old and live in Canada. Being a young métis male with long hair and some discernibly native features, I've grown used to the occasional needlessly hostile cop or security guard. It's just a part of my life. However, most of the time those encounters don't escalate very far, and have always happened in some other part of the city, so I never thought something like this would happen. It was a little after 1 a.m. and I was hanging out with two of my friends, Joey and Rick. We were hanging out at my house initially. However, my parents had gone to bed, and we didn't want to wake them up, so we decided to go out for a drive. We ended up going out to our old high school and chilled in the parking lot while listening to music. It's a relatively safe and well-lit area, so we didn't reckon anything bad would happen. While there, we joined a Discord call with some of our friends who were out of town for university and were having a good time, when I noticed a big white pickup truck pull into the parking lot. Right off the bat, I knew something was wrong. Most people that come into these parking lots to hang out are around our age, and not many teenagers drive a truck this nice or big. I tapped Joey on the shoulder and told him we should leave. But before he had time to react, the truck pulled up right behind our car and blocked us in. Inside was a relatively normal-looking guy, maybe about 30, with some stubble and a Hurley hat on. We saw him roll down his window and gesture for us to roll ours down, so not knowing what else to do, Joey complied. The guy then pulled up on our driver's side and identified himself as a cop who'd just finished his shift and wanted to know what we were doing out this late. Joey explained we were just hanging out listening to music, so the guy nodded and said he just wanted to make sure we weren't doing anything bad. Then he drove off. After that, all went back to normal, and we didn't think much of it. We were relieved that it wasn't anything worse. Joey joined the Discord call again, and all was normal. Then maybe 10 minutes later, I realized this guy had been driving back and forth down the street near the parking lot, watching us. Suddenly he came flying into the parking lot, turning on his high beams, as he slammed on the brakes maybe 2 stalls away from where we had parked, on our driver's side. Afterwards he proceeded to park at an angle, partially blocking us in, then rolled down his window, visibly very angry, as he started yelling at us. My initial reaction was to start filming, but unfortunately my phone had died a few minutes prior. So Joey rolled down his window, but as he did this, we heard the guy yell, "You guys have to leave. Get the hell out of here right now." Joey nodded and said something along the lines of, "All good. Can I see your badge?" The man exhaled loudly before reaching down, pulling out his badge and gun, which was pointed right at Joey. Thankfully he set both items down right after, but it was clearly another very blatant attempt at intimidation. In hindsight, we probably should have asked for his badge number, but the sight of a firearm had us frozen. After this, he went back on his tirade, yelling something along the lines of, "Get the hell out of here before I call on my duty friends to come mess you guys up." So we told him we'd leave, and before he went flying off, he yelled something along the lines of, "Don't be dumbasses. Quit doing shitty things like this." Needless to say, we ended up leaving after that, and just ended up going back to Joey's house and cooling off for a bit before he drove me and Rick home. This is the first time I've had an incident with a cop or security guard where I genuinely felt as though I was in danger. It's also worth noting that unless otherwise posted, this parking lot is designated as free for public use outside of school hours, and we didn't have the music very loud either, so he had no real reason to ask us to leave in the first place. I'm unsure of whether or not I will be filing a complaint. I would very much like to do so, both to get even, and ensure he's unable to do something like this again. However, there's no anonymous way to file a complaint on an officer in my city, and I know that a complaint could escalate the situation into some god-awful legal case, and it might be for the best to simply take the lesson from this situation and move on. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.